Before we get into the nitty-gritty around prototypes, I just thought, well, let's start with an example so you can start getting a sense as to why we need prototypes and at a high level what they are. So let's say we are a food restaurant and we want to display recipes for different types of food. How do we go about doing this? Well, let's start by creating a food object. And I'm just going to create an object via object literal syntax because that's the most simple. And now I want to instantiate our object with certain values when I initialize it. And we already seen how to do this at one of the previous lectures. So we're going to create our own init function that we can call. And this is just going to set the type of food to the type we pass into the function. So nothing too complicated there at all. And then we want to create a recipe method, which again will be a function. And in our case, we won't write out full recipes. We're just going to console log. This is a recipe for this type. And this is fine. We've done our object. So let's now say we've got donuts. Why is it saying a type is not defined? Oh, of course. In this function, in this init function, we have to pass type as an argument, which in this case is going to be donuts, and it's going to set the type on this food object as donuts. So now we have initialized this food object, defining its type as donuts. So when we execute this recipe function, I'd expect the console log to show this is a recipe for donuts. So let's see if that works. Food, and we execute recipe. And remember, to execute a function, you have to have parentheses. And there you go. This is a recipe for donuts. Cool. All is well and good. But what happens now if we don't just have donuts? What about if we want to create a whole list of different types of food? What can we do? And this is where object.create comes into play. And in the previous section, we went through object.create. So let's say donut equals object.create. And as its prototype, we are now going to pass food. Donut can now be initialized. And to prove that it's all worked, donut can access the recipe function. And this is a recipe for donuts. And the power of this is that we can create different types of foods. So let's create, I don't know, orange. Object.create. Also pass that food as its prototype. Now orange can be initialized. And again, orange has access to the method. And there you have it. This is a recipe for donuts, and this orange one says this is a recipe for oranges. I just want to ask you a question now. When we use object.create, what do you think is happening? Do you think it's creating a brand new food object? Or is it just referencing the original food object? What do you think? Well, let's see. Let's just move our code around. Let's create these two objects at the top. The other thing I want to do is just delete these function calls quickly. Okay, so all we've done now is we've created a donut and an orange via object.create, passing in the food object as its prototype. Now what we want to do is I want to change this food object. So if donut and orange were just creating a copy of food, it would have created a copy at this point on line 11 and line 12. But now on line 14, we're going to amend it. We're going to go food, recipe, and let's amend our function. Let's console log. I don't know, let's do capital letters now. Let's say you are now eating this type And because we want capitals, let's just go to uppercase. So what do you think would happen? Let's actually put these init functions at the top as well. What do you think would happen now when I go and execute that recipe function? Is it going to console log this is a recipe in small case, or is it going to go and console log the uppercase, you are now eating this type of food? What do you think will happen? Well, I'll tell you that I expect this latest console log to be consoled out to the screen. And the reason is that object.create doesn't create a new copy of an object. It always references the overall prototype, the original food object. So when we go donut and we go recipe and we execute that function, there you go. It's all in capitals. You're now eating donuts. And we can do the same with oranges. Orange.recipe. You're now eating oranges. So what is this telling us? Take a step back. This is telling us that object.create creates a new empty object for donut and for orange, and that the food object is only a fallback. If donut or orange don't have the property within themselves, they will fall back and look in the food object. But the important thing to remember is that donut and orange will only use the food object if they cannot find the property within themselves. Let me prove this to you. I just want to get rid of orange here and all of this. Let's just get rid of orange. Orange, let's get rid of the food. Let's get rid of orange. Okay, so at this point, if I go and console log out donut, you can see that donut has a type property of donuts. And that's because of that init function within the food object, where we assigned a property called type to this object. So you with me so far? So now, let's just get rid of that function call. So remember what I said? I said that if the donut has its own property, it's not going to go and look to the food object. It's almost like the food object is a fallback. So let's now put a type property on the food object itself. So food can have type, and that can be anything. Blah, blah, blah. What do you think is going to happen now when I run the recipe function on donuts? Do you think it's going to console log this is a recipe for donuts, or this is a recipe for blah, blah, blah? Well, as we would expect the donut to look at its own type property. It doesn't need to resort as a fallback to the food type. It's got its own type. So I'd expect the console to say this is a recipe for donuts. Let's see if that's right. Recipe. We console log. This is a recipe for donuts. So there you have it. This is an introduction to prototypes, how they work. You can kind of view them as just a fallback. And we can prove here that food is actually a prototype of donuts. How? Well, JavaScript has given us the isPrototypeOf method straight out of the box. So all we need to do here is console log. We access our food object and we go isPrototypeOf. And is it a prototype of donut? And there you have it. It resorts to true. So that tells us that food is actually a prototype of donut, which makes sense because that's what the object.create method does when we pass food as its prototype. But enough said, let's get into prototypes in more detail.